If you ask many Vietnam veterans what they remember most, they do not start with dramatic stories or cinematic moments. In fact, what stands out is how reluctant many were to talk at all. For years after the war, countless veterans avoided describing their experiences, not because they didn't remember, but because they weren't sure anyone would understand. And so a long, quiet silence grew around an entire generation. That silence is the starting point of this story. Not battle, not politics, but the heavy pause that veterans carried inside them when they returned to American streets that felt familiar, yet strangely distant. Most veterans agreed on one thing: the world they came home to did not match the world they had left. Neighborhoods had changed, friends had grown older, and the country was immersed in debates and cultural movements that veterans had watched only from afar. What struck many of them most deeply wasn't what happened overseas. It was how difficult it was to re-enter a life that had kept moving without them. When they were asked what they did not talk about, the answers tended to revolve around everyday things that people rarely associate with war. Many veterans found it difficult to explain how time felt different, how days blended together, how routines became anchors, how patience and endurance became part of their identity. They spoke quietly about the friendships formed in moments of uncertainty, the conversations shared during long stretches of waiting, and the strange sense of distance they felt when trying to describe these experiences to people who had never been there. One of the most common themes was disconnection. Veterans often said they felt like observers in their own hometowns, as if they were walking through familiar environments with unfamiliar eyes. Streets looked the same, but they themselves had changed in subtle ways. Colors felt sharper or duller, sounds more intense or more distant. The world seemed louder for some, quieter for others. These differences were hard to express. So many chose not to speak at all. Others described the challenge of returning to simple routines. Standing in line at a grocery store, sitting in a classroom, or attending a family gathering could suddenly feel foreign. Veterans said that the hardest part was not the memory of what they had seen, but the difficulty of adjusting back to ordinary life after years spent in unpredictable environments. This contrast created emotions they did not have words for, which left them silent even among close friends. For many, talking about the war felt risky, not because they feared judgment, but because they didn't want to burden others. They worried that their stories might feel too heavy, too distant, or too impossible to relate to. The result was a quiet kind of isolation, veterans surrounded by people, yet holding their most personal reflections inside. Some described how they avoided conversations entirely. When someone asked, "What was it like?" they smiled politely and answered with something vague. Not because they were hiding trauma, but because they knew the real answers were long, complicated, and shaped by emotions that did not fit into simple explanations. The experience of service, the bonds they formed, the moments of exhaustion, the pressure of responsibility, these were not memories veterans wanted to translate into dramatic tales. They were private chapters, meaningful in ways that words often failed to capture. And so a pattern emerged across the country. An entire generation returned home with thousands of stories, yet spoke only in fragments. They talked about the heat, the waiting, the music they listened to, the letters they wrote, the friendships that mattered, and the small routines that helped them stay grounded. But the deeper feelings, the ones that truly defined their experience, remained unspoken. In the next part, we explore what veterans said about the friendships and bonds that shaped their time overseas, relationships so intense and sincere that many felt no one back home could fully understand their depth. When veterans were asked what they remembered most intensely, many didn't speak about events or places. Instead, they talked about people, the friends who stood beside them during the most uncertain years of their lives. Yet even here, they chose their words carefully. Not because the memories were painful, but because such friendships were so profound that ordinary language felt too small to contain them. Veterans often said that the closest relationships they ever formed occurred far from home, in circumstances completely different from everyday American life. They described a kind of connection built not on shared hobbies or backgrounds, but on mutual understanding, responsibility, and the unspoken agreement that everyone was depending on one another. The depth of these bonds made them difficult to describe to people who had never experienced them. Some veterans explained that they felt closest to individuals they might never have met in civilian life. People from different states, different cultures, different traditions. Service brought them together, and the shared routines, long stretches of waiting, and constant reliance on each other created friendships that felt timeless. Veterans often said these bonds developed faster and deeper than almost any relationship they had before or after. The most striking part is how veterans described the conversations they had with one another. They talked not about dramatic moments, but about small, quiet exchanges, discussions during downtime, reflections shared under open skies, jokes told to break tension, stories from childhood, dreams for the future. In these moments, distance from home created closeness among strangers, and yet despite the strength of these friendships, many veterans rarely spoke about them when they returned home. They found it difficult to explain the sense of unity they felt, a unity built from trust, routine, and shared responsibility. Friends and family would listen, but veterans sensed that the listeners didn't fully grasp the intensity of those bonds. After all, most civilian friendships develop gradually, in comfortable environments. The friendships veterans described emerged from situations where people depended on each other in ways impossible to recreate. Some veterans admitted that they missed these friendships more than anything else. Not the places, not the atmosphere, but the people. Back home, they rarely found the same level of connection. The world moved at a different pace. Life became more individual, more distributed, less tightly woven. They felt grateful to be home, yet they also felt the quiet absence of the closeness they once knew. Others said that even when they reunited with people they had served with, things felt different. Time had passed, families had grown, careers had changed, and the context that shaped their bond no longer existed. Yet the respect remained. Veterans often described it as a kind of lifelong loyalty, an invisible thread that connected them, even if they didn't speak often. Many explained that these bonds were hard to share publicly because they were purely emotional. There were no simple anecdotes to summarize them, no short stories to make others understand their significance. So veterans kept them inside, protecting these memories like treasured heirlooms. Another reason veterans stayed quiet about their friendships was because discussing them meant touching on feelings that were difficult to revisit. Not painful necessarily, but intense, the kind of intensity that makes people turn inward. They remembered the jokes, the long hours, the conversations about home, the shared frustrations, the small moments of comfort, and the common determination to get through each day. This sense of mutual support was so central to their experience that many felt disconnected when they returned to a world where relationships were more flexible, less absolute, and rarely built on such deep trust. Veterans often said that civilian life lacked the clarity of purpose they had felt alongside their friends overseas. Even decades later, many still struggled to explain those friendships. They described them as the kind of emotional bond that shapes a person forever, even if the details fade. The connection remained in how they viewed responsibility, loyalty, patience, and the meaning of companionship. In the next part, we explore another theme veterans hesitated to discuss: the strange transition back to normal routines when the world around them expected them to resume life as if nothing had changed internally. When veterans spoke about coming home, they almost never described a dramatic moment or a sudden emotional shift. Instead, they talked about something far more subtle, a slow, quiet transition that felt both hopeful and strangely disorienting. They expected to slip back into their old routines, but discovered that routines were not the same, and neither were they. For many veterans, the surprise was not what changed overseas, but what changed at home. Life had moved on without them. Friends had started new jobs, families had grown, streets looked different, neighborhoods had shifted. The places they remembered from before felt familiar, yet carried a sense of distance, as if they were walking through memories instead of the present. One of the most difficult parts to explain was how ordinary activities felt unexpectedly complex. Veterans often said that the simple rhythm of daily life, shopping for groceries, sitting in class, going to a movie theater, riding a bus, required a kind of mental adjustment they hadn't anticipated. These were tasks they had done for years, yet now they seemed oddly out of sync with their internal sense of pace. They mentioned moments when they felt surrounded by noise that others barely noticed, or when normal conversations seemed too fast or too slow, or when crowds felt overwhelming even though no one else appeared uncomfortable. Veterans said these reactions were not dramatic. They were just different enough to make them feel slightly out of place. Many described an invisible transition, the shift from an environment where time felt structured and purposeful to one where days stretched freely. Overseas, routines had been clear and predictable: meals at certain hours, tasks at specific times, shared responsibilities. Home life, by contrast, offered a freedom that felt disorienting. They appreciated it, but also struggled to match their internal rhythm with the world around them. Another aspect that veterans seldom discussed was the sense of emotional delay. They returned home to families eager to reconnect, yet veterans sometimes felt unable to fully step into their old roles. They were happy to be home, but needed time to adjust, time to rebuild the parts of themselves that had quietly changed. They rarely mentioned this aloud. They didn't want to worry their families. But many said that this internal transition was far longer and more complex than anyone realized. Some veterans also spoke about expectations. People around them often hoped for immediate normalcy. Friends expected them to pick up old jokes, old habits, old routines. Families wished for instant closeness. Society assumed that leaving the war meant leaving every emotion behind. Veterans felt pressure to smile, to reassure others, to appear unchanged, even when they were processing experiences they couldn't quite put into words. This mismatch between expectation and reality left many feeling isolated, not because they lacked support, but because the people who cared for them simply didn't have the tools to understand the quiet adjustments happening inside. Veterans rarely blamed anyone for this. They understood that their loved ones wanted everything to be fine. But unspoken expectations can create distance, and many veterans carried that distance silently. Some expressed that the hardest part was not the past, but the present, learning how to reconnect with friends who had never experienced long periods of uncertainty or abrupt changes in environment. Veterans said that conversations at home often felt light compared to the depth of discussions they had overseas. It wasn't that the topics were trivial. It was that veterans had become accustomed to a different emotional landscape. Another thing many veterans noted was the sense of responsibility they brought home with them. They had learned to be dependable, to look out for those around them, to take challenges seriously. Back home, this strong sense of responsibility sometimes made them feel older than people their age. They spoke of it quietly, almost apologetically, as if they weren't sure how to explain the maturity they had gained. Yet despite all these quiet difficulties, veterans often said they were grateful for the chance to rebuild their lives. They didn't express regret, only the complexity of transitioning from one world to another. They acknowledged the small victories, rediscovering hobbies, reconnecting with family, finding jobs, starting routines, building relationships. These steps, though slow, marked the return to a life that they wanted to embrace, even if the journey back felt longer than expected. In the next part, we explore another subject veterans rarely discussed: the emotional weight of responsibility, and how the decisions they made, even the small ones, stayed with them long after they returned home. When veterans reflected on their years of service, many avoided details not because they wished to forget, but because the emotions tied to responsibility were too complex to summarize. They described a sense of duty that shaped every decision, every routine, every moment of their experience, a kind of emotional weight that didn't simply disappear once they returned home. This responsibility wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was quiet, constant, and deeply personal. Veterans often said they felt responsible for much more than their own well-being. They looked out for the people beside them, supported those who felt overwhelmed, and tried to remain steady even when the environment around them was unpredictable. That daily accountability became part of who they were. When they came home, that sense of responsibility didn't stay behind. It came with them, woven into their habits and thoughts. Veterans often mentioned that, without even realizing it, they started observing their surroundings differently, paying attention to details that others ignored, anticipating problems before they appeared. They didn't talk about these behaviors because they felt ordinary to them, but they were in many ways the product of years spent learning to stay aware for the sake of others. One of the hardest things for veterans to express was how deeply this responsibility affected their choices. Many said they weighed decisions more carefully than before, not out of fear, but because they had learned to understand the consequences of small actions. They approached life with greater caution, greater patience, and greater thoughtfulness. These qualities often made them seem older than their actual age. Veterans also spoke about the emotional pressure of trying to guide people in their civilian lives while silently managing their own adjustments. Friends came to them for advice. Co-workers leaned on them during stressful moments. Family members asked for help, and veterans rarely refused. They felt that offering stability was simply their role, even if it left them drained. Yet they rarely admitted this to others, because responsibility had become second nature. Another element veterans found difficult to describe was the subtle way responsibility shaped their understanding of relationships. They often felt protective of the people around them, even in everyday situations. A friend feeling uncertain, a colleague dealing with pressure, a family member overwhelmed, veterans instinctively stepped in. They didn't see this as extraordinary. They saw it as continuity from the roles they assumed years earlier. In interviews, some veterans described this instinct as both a strength and a challenge. It gave them purpose, but it also made it difficult to relax, to let go, to trust that others could carry their own burdens. Veterans rarely talked about this openly, because they didn't want to appear controlling or overly serious. But privately, they admitted that it shaped much of their behavior long after their service ended. Responsibility also came in quieter emotional forms. Veterans said they often replayed decisions they made during their service, wondering if they could have supported someone differently, spoken more gently, encouraged more strongly. These reflections weren't tied to dramatic events. They were tied to the ordinary responsibilities of living closely with others in uncertain conditions. They carried these reflections with them, sometimes for decades. Many veterans acknowledged that responsibility changed their values. They learned to appreciate small acts of kindness, steady habits, and the people who stayed close to them. They became more patient, more observant, more deliberate. Yet they found it difficult to explain these changes to people who hadn't shared similar experiences. Perhaps the most meaningful part of veterans' reflections was how they described the balance between responsibility and gratitude. They felt grateful for every person who stood beside them during difficult times, grateful for quiet encouragement, grateful for the friendships that helped them stay grounded. That gratitude lived alongside responsibility, forming an emotional landscape that was complex but deeply human. And that, veterans said, was the main reason they rarely spoke openly about these feelings. They didn't want to dramatize their service or appear burdened. They simply knew that responsibility had shaped them in ways few people truly understood. In the next part, we explore another theme veterans hesitated to discuss: the emotional distance that sometimes formed between them and those who stayed home. A subtle, quiet gap that neither side fully knew how to bridge. One of the most delicate subjects veterans almost never spoke about was the quiet, emotional distance that formed when they returned home. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't intentional. It was something much softer, a subtle space between themselves and the people they loved, a space they didn't know how to close. Veterans often said they expected to slip back into their old relationships easily. They imagined reconnecting instantly, laughing the same way, falling into familiar rhythms. But when they arrived home, they discovered that silence sometimes settled between them and others. Not because anything was wrong, but because their inner worlds had shifted in ways they couldn't fully express. Family members asked questions with genuine curiosity, but veterans found themselves giving short, vague answers. Not to hide anything, but because their experiences felt too layered to summarize. They didn't want to overwhelm anyone, and they didn't want to invite sympathy. So they smiled, reassured their loved ones, and said they were fine, even when they were still learning to adjust. Some veterans described how conversations with old friends felt different. Jokes that once made them laugh now felt distant. Topics that used to excite them seemed trivial or unfamiliar. It wasn't that they no longer cared. They simply felt as if they were standing one step outside their old social circles, looking in. They struggled to explain this subtle emotional gap because it didn't come from sadness or disappointment. It came from the fact that they had lived through years of experiences that didn't translate neatly into everyday life. The world at home moved forward with birthdays, holidays, promotions, friendships, and quiet routines. Veterans had moved forward too, just in a different direction. Many described moments when they sat with friends and felt grateful to be there, yet unexpectedly separate. A familiar bar, a childhood living room, a favorite street corner, all of these places felt unchanged, but veterans themselves had gained new habits of observation new layers of reflection, new ways of processing the world. This difference created a quiet, emotional distance they didn't know how to bridge. The most difficult aspect was that loved ones often sensed this distance without understanding it. Families wanted to help, but didn't know how. Friends reached out, but sometimes misinterpreted the veterans' silence. Veterans felt caught between wanting closeness and not wanting to reveal emotions that were still settling inside them. Some veterans described how impossible it felt to explain what they had learned about patience, responsibility, and uncertainty. They didn't want to talk about the daily pressure of service, the long periods of waiting, the way they depended on others, and others depended on them. These memories were meaningful, but they didn't belong in casual conversation. They required a level of emotional context that was hard to recreate. So, veterans often chose silence, not as a barrier, but as a form of protection, for themselves and for the people around them. They worried that speaking too openly would make others uncomfortable or create misunderstandings. Silence felt safer, even though it sometimes deepened the emotional distance they wished they could overcome. Yet despite this quiet gap, veterans rarely lost their desire for connection. They valued their families deeply and cherished friendships that lasted through their service. Many said that the distance gradually faded as they rebuilt routines, rediscovered shared interests, and created new memories that belonged to their post-service lives. It just took time, far more time than they expected. A recurring theme in veteran interviews was the idea of catching up. They felt like they had missed chapters of their own story, years that friends and family experienced together while they were gone. Veterans often said that they tried to fill those missing chapters by listening more than they talked. They made space for others' stories, hoping that doing so would help them reconnect. Another quiet truth veterans carried was a sense of gratitude. Even when the emotional distance felt confusing, they appreciated every effort from the people who tried to understand them. A gentle question, a patient conversation, a shared meal. These small gestures helped rebuild closeness, slowly, piece by piece. When veterans reflected on their return home, they often said that the most unexpected challenge wasn't adjusting to a new environment, it was adjusting to themselves. They felt familiar on the outside, yet changed in ways they didn't fully recognize. This quiet transformation made the rebuilding of identity one of the most personal journeys they undertook, a journey they rarely described out loud. Many veterans explained that, during their service, they had learned behaviors and mindsets that made sense in unpredictable environments, but felt out of place back home. They became more cautious, more observant, more protective of others. They waited before reacting, evaluated situations with care, and thought more deeply before speaking. These habits, once necessary, now shaped their daily lives in subtle ways. One veteran described it as carrying two versions of myself. The version shaped by home, easygoing, familiar, spontaneous, and the version shaped by service, steady, vigilant, quietly focused. Reconciling these versions required time, patience, and a willingness to understand the person they had become. Others said they had to relearn how to trust the calm. When routine life felt too quiet, they wondered whether they were missing something. When days passed without pressure, they felt a strange tension, as if part of their mind expected some sudden shift. This wasn't anxiety in its usual sense. It was simply the echo of years spent in environments where things changed quickly and unpredictably. Veterans rarely spoke of this because it sounded too abstract. How could they explain to family members that calmness felt unfamiliar? How could they put into words the feeling of being grateful for normal life while still needing time to adjust to its rhythm? Another challenge they described was redefining their sense of purpose. During service, purpose was clear. Every person had a role. Every day had tasks. Every decision felt connected to something larger. Home life offered freedom, but with freedom came uncertainty. Veterans sometimes struggled to understand where they fit in this new landscape. They wanted purpose, but purpose now needed to be rebuilt from scratch. For many, finding work was the first step. They threw themselves into jobs, hoping that routine would rebuild their sense of identity. But even here, they encountered subtle challenges. Some felt older than their peers, not physically, but in perspective. They took responsibilities seriously, approached tasks methodically, and viewed teamwork differently. These qualities were strengths, but they sometimes made veterans feel out of sync with co-workers who hadn't experienced the same shifts. A surprising number of veterans said that hobbies helped them reconnect with themselves. Painting, writing, woodworking, fishing, running. Activities that allowed them to quiet their minds and rediscover parts of themselves untouched by service. Through hobbies, they found a bridge between who they had been and who they wanted to become. Relationships also played a crucial role. Veterans explained that emotional rebuilding often happened through gentle, consistent support from people around them. A friend who checked in regularly, a partner who listened without pushing, a family member who offered patience instead of questions. These moments, small but steady, helped veterans rediscover their identity in a world that often moved too quickly to notice quiet transformations. Some veterans found identity through helping others. Their sense of responsibility naturally drew them toward roles where they could support people, mentoring younger workers, guiding friends through difficulties, volunteering at local organizations. Helping others gave them purpose that felt honest and grounded. One of the most poignant themes was the rediscovery of dreams. Before service, many veterans had imagined futures, careers, travel, families, education. Returning home required reopening those dreams, dusting them off, and seeing which ones still fit. Some dreams felt distant, others felt possible again. Veterans said this process was both painful and liberating. But perhaps the most important step in rebuilding identity was acceptance. Acceptance that change had occurred, acceptance that growth was ongoing, acceptance that feeling different did not mean being broken. Veterans emphasized that understanding themselves again was not about forgetting their past, but about integrating it. They rarely discussed this out loud, because identity is personal, and describing inner change is difficult. But their stories reveal a shared truth. Rebuilding took time, and the journey was not linear. Some days felt easy, others challenging. Some moments brought clarity, others confusion. Yet through all of it, veterans carried a quiet strength, the ability to adapt, reflect, and rebuild with patience and dignity. This strength became the foundation of their new identity, shaping the way they approached work, relationships, and life itself. When veterans looked back on their return home, many said that the most challenging part wasn't adjusting to routines or reconnecting with loved ones. The hardest part was something less visible, but far more personal: rebuilding a sense of meaning in a life that no longer followed the structure they had grown used to. During their service, meaning had been built into every day. There was always a task, always a direction, always a purpose connected to something beyond the individual. Even in the quietest moments, veterans felt part of a larger story. Coming home changed that instantly. Suddenly, the world expected them to create meaning on their own, to choose careers, set goals, define success, establish routines, and build futures without the clear framework they once relied on. For many veterans, this shift felt overwhelming, not because they lacked ambition, but because the emotional compass they had depended on for years needed time to recalibrate. Veterans described this search for meaning in gentle, reflective terms. They spoke about the long process of understanding which parts of their past they wanted to carry forward, and which parts they needed to leave behind. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about deciding how their experiences would shape the people they became next. Some veterans explained that meaning returned through simple, steady actions. They built families, nurtured friendships, developed careers, and slowly discovered new forms of purpose. They found meaning in being present for their children, supporting their partners, mentoring younger co-workers, or contributing to their communities. These everyday roles, though quiet, became the foundation of their new lives. Others said that meaning came through service, not military service, but community involvement. They helped at youth programs, volunteered at shelters, assisted neighbors going through difficult times, or offered guidance to fellow veterans. In these moments, they felt the same sense of purpose they once knew, but expressed in gentler, more personal ways. For some, meaning arrived through creativity. Writing, music, painting, woodworking. These activities allowed veterans to express emotions they rarely discussed aloud. Creativity gave them a voice that didn't require explanations or details. It became a private dialogue between their past and their present. Veterans also described the importance of time. Meaning could not be forced. It had to be discovered gradually. Some said that they felt impatient at first, hoping to feel normal again as quickly as possible. But over time, they learned that meaning grows slowly, through reflection, through acceptance, through living day after day with honesty and curiosity. Another powerful theme was gratitude. Many veterans said that, with time, they developed a deep appreciation for things they once took for granted. Quiet mornings, shared meals, long conversations, stable routines. These small moments became markers of peace, reminders that meaning could be found not just in dramatic experiences, but in the simplicity of everyday life. The search for meaning also reshaped veterans' understanding of themselves. They learned to acknowledge their emotional depth, to accept their growth, and to value their resilience. They recognized that life's purpose does not remain fixed. It evolves, just as they had evolved. At the same time, veterans admitted that they rarely talked about this journey openly. The concept of finding meaning felt too abstract, too intimate. They didn't want to sound philosophical or overly reflective. They didn't want to make others uncomfortable. So they kept these thoughts to themselves and let them grow quietly. Many veterans said the search for meaning helped them become more patient, more empathetic, and more aware of what truly mattered. They learned to prioritize relationships over achievements, kindness over recognition, presence over performance. These lessons shaped not only their futures but also the lives of the people around them. Perhaps the most profound insight veterans shared was that meaning is not something you discover all at once. It arrives in small steps: a new job, a restored relationship, a moment of clarity, a peaceful day, a decision that feels right. And every step builds on the last. This slow, steady rediscovery of meaning became one of the most transformative parts of their post-service lives. It helped them heal, grow, and reconnect with the world on their own terms. When veterans looked back on their post-service lives, they often described one challenge that didn't appear on the surface: but shaped everything quietly, learning to trust the future again. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't uncertainty. It was something subtler, a cautious relationship with tomorrow that had taken root during their years away from home. During service, the future was rarely a clear path. Life unfolded in fragments, a day at a time, a task at a time, a moment at a time. Veterans learned not to think too far ahead, not to make long-term plans, not to expect predictability. This mindset protected them, kept them focused, helped them adapt. But when they came home, they discovered that this habit did not fade overnight. Many veterans explained that making plans, even simple ones, felt unfamiliar. Conversations about long-term goals, careers, or personal dreams seemed abstract, distant, almost theoretical. They struggled to connect emotionally with future possibilities because they had spent years grounding themselves in the present. Some described this as waiting for things to feel real again. The future had to earn their trust. Veterans rarely talked about this openly because it sounded too philosophical. They didn't want to seem hesitant or unsure. They didn't want people to think they lacked direction. But privately, they admitted that imagining the future required rebuilding a certain kind of confidence, confidence that stability was permanent, not temporary. One of the first steps in learning to trust the future came through structure. Jobs, education, family routines, and personal projects helped veterans create a sense of continuity. The more predictable their days became, the easier it was to imagine predictable years. A steady job wasn't just income, it was proof that life could move forward. A new class wasn't just learning, it was a reminder that they could grow again. A relationship wasn't just companionship, it was evidence that long-term connection was possible. Veterans also spoke about moments that slowly reintroduced hope. A new friendship, a successful project, a holiday celebrated without unease, an unexpected opportunity. These moments didn't erase caution, but they softened it. They showed veterans that the future was not a threat. It was a landscape they could shape. Some found comfort in routines: morning coffee, evening walks, time with family, working with their hands, quiet hobbies. These ordinary moments gave their lives rhythm, and rhythm allowed them to feel anchored. Once anchored, thinking ahead no longer felt risky. For many veterans, trusting the future also meant trusting themselves, accepting that they were capable of building something meaningful beyond the experiences that had shaped them. They learned to recognize their own strength, not as something forged in difficulty alone, but as something equally capable of creating peace, stability, and personal growth. Veterans often spoke about the importance of patience. The future became less intimidating when they allowed themselves to move slowly, to make decisions carefully, to build their lives one step at a time. They understood that healing wasn't a straight line, and that the journey toward confidence required consistency rather than speed. Another theme veterans mentioned was forgiveness, not directed at anyone else, but directed at themselves. They forgave the moments when they felt disconnected, the days when they weren't sure what came next, the periods when trusting the future felt impossible. This self-compassion helped them move forward with more gentleness and less pressure. Over time, as veterans embraced new roles, employees, partners, parents, mentors, community members, the future began to feel less like an unknown and more like a companion they could walk alongside. They built lives filled with purpose, connection, and hope, often stronger than what they had imagined before their service. Yet despite this profound journey, veterans spoke little about it. They didn't view themselves as inspirational or heroic, for rebuilding their sense of trust. They saw it simply as part of being human, a quiet evolution that unfolded in the background of everyday life. One of the most subtle yet powerful experiences veterans carried home was a changed sense of time. They didn't talk about it often, not because it was painful, but because it was nearly impossible to explain. Time, something so ordinary for most people, had taken on a different shape during their service, and returning to the civilian rhythm required far more emotional adjustment than anyone around them realized. Veterans frequently described their years away from home as a period when days felt both long and short, structured, yet unpredictable. Time was measured not by weekends or holidays, but by routines, tasks, waiting periods, and moments of reflection. They became accustomed to a rhythm that didn't match the flow of civilian life, a rhythm shaped by attention, patience, and awareness. When they returned, many discovered that ordinary time, the kind that governs work schedules, social plans, and everyday responsibilities, felt strangely unfamiliar. Friends talked about the past few years as if they had passed quickly. Veterans, however, often felt as if they had lived an entire lifetime in the same period. This difference created a quiet disconnect that was difficult to voice. Veterans said they noticed small things before anyone else. The way days moved faster or slower, how people rushed from one task to another, how expectations came quickly, how conversations turned from topic to topic without pause. To veterans, the world seemed to accelerate around them, while their internal pace moved in a different direction. This wasn't stress or discomfort. It was simply the result of having lived according to another tempo. Many veterans admitted they felt as though they had two calendars, the one on the wall and the one inside their minds. The external calendar moved predictably, filled with appointments and events. The internal calendar moved more slowly, shaped by reflection, memory, and a sense of presence that never quite left them after returning home. Because this difference was subtle, veterans rarely brought it up. They didn't want to sound strange or overly introspective. They didn't want to worry their families, and they didn't want to complicate simple conversations by introducing something others might find difficult to relate to. So they held this feeling quietly, letting time recalibrate on its own. Some veterans said that clocks and schedules felt rigid compared to the fluid sense of time they had grown used to. In service, time stretched and contracted, depending on the moment. A single hour could feel like a day. A whole day could disappear without noticing. Back home, time felt orderly and linear again, but veterans needed patience to realign themselves with that order. Others noted the opposite. Life at home felt fast, almost too fast. Deadlines, appointments, and social expectations came quickly. The pace of normal life seemed relentless, and they found themselves longing for the slower, more deliberate rhythm they had once relied on, even if that rhythm came from difficult circumstances. One of the most intimate challenges veterans described was the feeling of time lost. While everyone else had lived their lives, building relationships, advancing careers, celebrating milestones, veterans sometimes felt caught between chapters. They didn't resent this. They simply needed time to catch up emotionally, to reconnect with the timeline they had stepped away from. This sense of temporal distance influenced their approach to long-term planning. Veterans often became more patient, more deliberate. They were less likely to rush decisions. They valued moments of stillness. They appreciated quiet mornings and peaceful evenings. They understood that time was something to be lived, not raced through. Veterans also spoke about how their perception of age changed. People their age seemed younger than they felt, not physically, but in perspective. Veterans experienced their 20s differently. While their peers felt like they were beginning life, veterans felt as if they had lived several lives already. This wasn't a burden, just a different relationship with time. As years passed, many veterans found that their sense of time gradually aligned with everyday life again. Work, relationships, and routines helped bring their internal rhythm closer to the external world. But even then, a part of them remained more aware of how precious time truly was, how quickly it could change, how deeply it could be felt, how significantly it could shape a person. When veterans were asked, years later, what stayed with them the longest, many did not mention specific events or dramatic memories. Instead, they spoke about the long, slow search for inner peace, a search they rarely described aloud, yet one that shaped the core of their lives after returning home. Peace didn't arrive suddenly. It wasn't a moment. It wasn't a decision. It was a gradual understanding that grew quietly over time, rooted in acceptance, reflection, and the desire to build a meaningful life out of everything they had learned. Many veterans explained that inner peace began with acknowledging their own transformation. They realized they didn't need to become the person they had been before. They didn't need to force themselves into old roles or hide the depth of their experiences. Peace came from accepting that growth, even when shaped by difficult chapters, was part of being human. This acceptance didn't erase uncertainty. Veterans said they still felt moments of distance, caution, and introspection. But instead of resisting those feelings, they began to see them as part of their story. Not obstacles, but reminders of what they had lived through and how much they had matured. Another key to finding peace was learning to speak when they were ready. Not about details, not about events, not about moments they preferred to keep private, but about emotions. Veterans found comfort in sharing how they felt rather than what they saw. Conversations about responsibility, patience, identity, and hope helped them reconnect with loved ones in honest, gentle ways. Some discovered peace in new beginnings, starting families, building careers, pursuing education, or creating businesses. These commitments gave them opportunities to shape futures that belonged entirely to them, not defined by past chapters, but enriched by them. Veterans often said that watching their lives unfold step by step helped them believe deeply in the possibility of renewal. Others found peace in service. Helping others, whether through volunteering, mentoring, or simply being a steady presence in someone's life, brought them a sense of purpose that felt familiar, yet healthier than before. It allowed them to use their strength in constructive, supportive ways, offering guidance without carrying the weight alone. For many veterans, peace also emerged through stillness, moments of quiet reflection in early mornings, evening walks through calm neighborhoods, the comfort of routine, the softness of ordinary days. These small experiences became anchors, reminders that life did not need to be intense to be meaningful. Veterans often said that inner peace grew in the silence, not in the noise. Nature, too, played a powerful role. Some veterans described how time outdoors, fishing, hiking, working with soil, or simply sitting in open spaces, settled their minds. The natural world moved at a pace that made sense to them, unhurried, steady, grounded. One of the most profound insights veterans shared was that peace was less about forgetting the past and more about making room for the future. They learned that two truths could coexist, that their service shaped them deeply, and that they could still build a full, hopeful, loving life beyond it. As veterans grew older, many said they finally understood the balance between remembering and moving forward. They no longer felt the need to hide their experiences, nor the need to relive them. They carried their memories with respect, not fear. They allowed themselves to grow, to dream, and to reconnect with the world gently and honestly. What surprised many veterans most was how this inner peace strengthened their relationships. The emotional distance that once stood between them and their loved ones gradually faded. Patience replaced tension. Understanding replaced silence. Shared experiences replaced the quiet gaps of earlier years. Veterans often said that they found peace not only within themselves, but within the bonds they rebuilt over time. And perhaps the most meaningful part of their journey was recognizing that peace was not a destination. It was a practice, a way of seeing life with perspective, gratitude, and resilience. Veterans learned to cherish moments of calm, to value the people around them, and to trust that their future could be shaped by more than the challenges of their past. As they reflected on their lives decades later, many veterans said that the greatest lesson they carried home was simple, yet profound. That courage is not only shown in difficult moments, but also in the long, patient work of building a peaceful life afterward. This is what they rarely talked about. Not the events themselves, but the years of becoming whole again. Not the dramatic memories, but the quiet strength that grew from them. Not the past, but the peace they learned to create every day.